So at the beginning, I feel like I'm obliged to make a caveat, which is I'm not even close to being an ECD expert. As I will show later, ECD is an extremely complex framework in which measurement model is a tiny portion. So yeah, I don't know how to implement this. I'll try my best to talk about it, hopefully in a not too superficial manner. And my objective is to let you gentlemen know there is such thing out there. So that's why we have the term very gentle. Okay, this is why. Yeah, this I don't want to make you think I'm the go-to guy, because I'm not. Actually, it took me lots of courage to stand here to present on this. Okay. So. Oh, inshallah, yeah. Don't forget that. Okay. So before we talk about the ECD thing, I want to mention briefly about this guy. He's the main developer of ECD. His name is Robert Mislevy. As you can see, he used to be professor at University of Maryland. He left after I joined the program in 2 years. Hopefully not because of me. He went back to ETS. And here we have at the bottom page, his Google Scholar page. He has been cited close to 15,000 times. Psychometrics is a really small field. Being cited that many times, he is definitely, to me, a top-notch world-class scholar. Up there with Howard Weiner, David Thiessen, people like that. And the first semester I got there, he had a course on ECD. The whole course is on ECD. And I have to be honest with you guys. During that course, what I try to do is to stay awake, because it's really abstract and complex, But the bottom line is, I got all his slides, and some of them I'm going to use today. Okay, hopefully, to borrow some of his wisdom. Alrighty, so the outline of the presentation, we have 4 parts. First, we are going to talk about evidentiary reasoning. This is the foundation of the whole framework. It's based on a very rigorous reasoning process. Then we are going to talk about the structure of ECD. Then ECD used in testing industry. Then the last part, how we're going to apply that in the center, more relevant to us. Okay, so part 1, evidentiary reasoning. Before we do that, we are going to ask, what is assessment? So here is like a definition. Assessment is about getting evidence about what students know from some perspective under constraints, using technologies for some purposes. Here you can see we need evidence. We are going to infer. So to do this in a scientific manner, you need a framework, which is the evidentiary reasoning. Okay, what inference is? So based on this, inference is reasoning from what we know and what we observe to explanations, conclusions, or predictions. Think about the center. What we do is we reason from the student's performance to what their abilities are. That's what we do. And we always reason in the presence of uncertainty. Okay? You think about the structural equation modeling work. All these latent abilities are a circle, which means something we cannot see, so it's uncertain. And second part of evidentiary reasoning is data versus evidence. So a datum becomes evidence in some analytic problem when its relevance to conjectures being considered is established. So if we think about, like we say, a student a GAT score, verbal reasoning in the GAT is low, because we have psychometric evidence. There we have to show that their performance on the GAT test, those data, they are evidence. But how to do that? We have to establish the link between those. I'm going to show more later, but that's the thing. Conjectures and the understanding of what constitutes evidence about them. It emanates from variables, concepts, and the relationship of the domain. If you think this is abstract, please rest assured you are not alone. I still think it's very abstract. I just read from there. Hopefully, by giving example, it's going to be more tangible later. Okay? Alrighty. So back to our example. If we want some data we collect to become evidence, for our inference, there are 3 properties that must be established, as shown here. Relevance. It has to be relevant. It has to be credible. And it needs to have the inferential force. Okay? So those are the 3 things. And, this whole ECD framework, this evidential reasoning is they borrow a lot from this guy, Stephen Toulmin. He's a British philosopher Okay, so the idea of this thing, there are several parts. First, you have claim, conjecture, hypothesis, stuff like that. Using our center as example, like what kind of claims do we make? Say a student has a high GAT score, we think he's qualified to enter a competitive, maybe engineering program here. That's the kind of claim we make. Data, in our case, is their test performance. And the warrant, which I'm going to show next slides, this is a chain of reasoning process. It's very abstract, but hopefully with the example, we can see how it goes. So the first step, you make is from claim to data. So here, D is our claim. We try to make some, claim, which is C. To give you an example, this is also from, Tuman's, book, and also from Miss Levy's slide. Those are directly from Miss Levy's slides. So, for example, if we have data like Harry was born in Bermuda, so can we make the claim that Harry is a British subject? Can we make a claim like that? If we want to do that, what else do we need? Okay, we need a warrant, right? We need some, evidence, warrant. So what is evidence? Because a person born in Bermuda is a British subject. Okay, this is our evidence or some. This is our warrant here. But how do we back our warrant? Why can't we say a person born in Bermuda is a British subject? Think about the reasoning process. How do we back up this warrant? Because the British Nationality Act, which says, if a person is born in Bermuda, he is a British subject. Okay, this is the reasoning process. But here are there any exceptions that might, invalidate this whole reasoning process? Yes, there are. Then we have qualifiers. You see unless on the right part of it. So unless, a person is born in Bermuda might not be British subject because the parents might not be British subjects. So that's the qualifier. That's the reasoning you need. That's the exception. That's going to invalidate the previous reasoning process. Okay? And you might have another qualifiers. It can be more than one. Or one becomes a naturalized citizen of another country. Like say one parent, the mother becomes American. In that case, the kid might not be a British subject. So basically the qualifier here is you have to think about all the exceptions in your reasoning process to make sure the link between your data and the thing is robust. Okay. Then we have a rebuttal. So to support our two exceptions, we need here we have the one. So Harry was born in Bermuda. He's not a British subject because his father is an American citizen. Okay? So this is an example. If you think about this, this is really a rigorous reasoning process. Okay? We use that to draw, inference. Okay? To base on our data, what kind of claims we want to make. Okay? So this is a very, very gentle snapshot of this evidentiary reasoning. Okay? And the whole ECD is based on this concept. And with that in our mind, and let's go to our, the meat of the presentation about evidence-centered design. Okay? Before we do that, I think it's, it might be helpful if we look at our traditional test development process. So how do we develop tests in a traditional manner? Think about it. For example, assuming we are, making an achievement test. What do? First, we gather a group of SMEs, subject matter experts. Get a panel of them. Get their expertise. What are we trying to measure in this test? Then we review textbooks, course syllabi, standards, etc. That's what they do. Then there might be some previous empirical studies that we can use, right? We can borrow, strengthen. Then we produce a test specification table that lists relevant content topics and the cognitive levels or skills, a two-way specification table, like the way we have here. And then we write in test items based on the test specification table. Then this is the kind of process we go through. So think about it at the end. Then we do some post hoc procedures, like a validation, like a diff study. We do that post hoc, right? So we are hoping, we are crossing our fingers like nothing is going to happen. It's going to invalidate our test. So this is a traditional test development process. But ECD, it's, it works in a reverse direction. So we have the definition here from the developer of ECD. ECD is a principled framework for designing, producing, and delivering educational assessment. Okay, that's the definition of ECD there. And ECD, as I said earlier, it's very complex. It has 5 main layers. We have domain analysis, domain modeling, conceptual assessment framework, which is the meat of the ECD, assessment implementation, and assessment delivery. We're going to go through each one of them. So what is domain analysis? So think about each test is a sample from some domains of KSAs. By the way, KSA is not Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's knowledge, skill, and ability. Okay, I just noticed this morning, this is a kind of a coincidence, the acronym is the same. Okay, so it's a sample. You cannot test all the possible samples, right? You have to sample from some of them. Like, for example, our achievement test, SAAT, about the different content knowledge we will try to test. What do we do here? We choose a sample, right? This is what I've learned so far. So in the domain analysis stage, ECD requires identification of the relevant domain and investigation of its characteristics. Usually ask those questions. What KSAs are important? How are they represented? How are they related to each other? How are they generally acquired? How are the KSAs used in the real world? What sometimes if you do not know, sometimes domain analysis requires you sending out surveys to people in the field to know, what is really going on, to get their idea. And some can be pretty important. For example, if I used to work in a licensure testing company, what they do is they want to make sure what has been tested in the licensure test is not some skill they acquire after they get a job. So you see the reasoning there? Usually they need a license to get a job. So you cannot test them on knowledge that they are going to get after they get a job. So you're going to make sure those things don't happen there. Otherwise, you cannot really test them. Without license, they cannot get a job. This is the domain analysis part. Then we have domain modeling. So this part is to build a assessment argument. Think about the evidentiary reasoning process we mentioned earlier. So in this argument, usually there are 3 parts. You have a claim, like before. Then you have data. Then you have warrant. This is not the full evidentiary reasoning process yet, because later we're going to do more. This is more like a baby version of the next part, the domain modeling. This is the second layer. Okay, so now that's the third part, which is the most substantial part of ECD. It's called a CAF, Conceptual Assessment Framework. It consists of 3 basic models. As you can see there, we have a student model, we have evidence model, we have a task model, which I'm going to try to talk about them a little bit, each one by one. So the first one is a student model. And this one is basically based on the idea, a quote from Samuel Messick, the famous validity guy. Okay, what complex of knowledge, skill, or attributes should be assessed? Presumably because they are tied to explicit or implicit objectives of instruction or otherwise valued by society. So think about the presentation Dr. Harm gave last week. We are thinking about higher order thinking skill, right? If we want to measure that, we have to start from here. What complex, what kind of HOTS we try to measure? Because it's valued by society, and how, what are we going to measure? This is the first step, okay, student model. The second step is, if you look at it at the top, what behaviors or performances should reveal those constructs? So think about, it should be relevant, right? What we try to ask our examinee to do should be relevant to what we try to assess. Okay, so this is the evidence model. And the third part is what tasks or situations should elicit those behaviors. So in our cases, what kind of items should we write? What kind of item format? Just multiple choice? Constructive response, maybe simulation-based? Those are the questions we have. That's a task model, Okay. Student, give me one, it's here. It's going to be more in detail. So in the student model, as you can see there, the variables describe characteristics of examinees. So we try to think about what knowledge skill we try to measure. So in our get case, the verbal part, for example, if we try to measure verbal reasoning, right? Necessary for college success. And those are the circles there. That's our student model. Did I answer your question, Dr. Faisal? Okay. So we want to make inference about their, verbal reasoning, right? Think about get verbal. That's what we try to do. So that's the whole thing. As I said earlier, everything is in a circle. In a structured equation modeling world, circle is something latent you cannot say. You cannot see. You have to, use some observed variables. Okay. Then it comes the evidence model. In evidence model, it concerns features of student work. So an evidence model lay out the argument from reasoning from what students say and do to what's important about it and how to revise beliefs about the value of student model variables. So think about this case. If a student got verbal, he got a really high score, that's evidence, right? We think he has high verbal reasoning skill. As you can see here, remember I mentioned earlier, student model is circle. Now you have those squares. They mean something manifest, something observable. Okay? We try to infer from something you can observe to something latent you cannot observe. Okay? So this is the evidence model. But remember earlier we said we need to establish that data is evidence. That's the necessary reasoning part. Okay? So in terms of the evidence model, what we do is first we have work products. Then we extract from them the necessary evidence. Right? This might be straightforward if you think about multiple choice questions, right? We just look at the key, the correct key with the response. If they match, we give them a 1. If not, we give a 0, right? It can be much more complex when we talk about, like, say, if you want to score an essay using an automated scoring system, by computer. How to extract the relevant feature is become much, much more complex. Yeah, several years ago, I read about this literature. They were trying to, test how to use computer to score like essays. They tried to extract different features. Then they realized it's not really reliable. The most reliable predictor of the high score in the essay is still the essay length. So you can see it's really complex, So anyway, so the product, how do we get from product to observable variable? There are lots of things are going on. How to score them. Okay, so this is the whole process, from evidence to student model. Okay, then the task model. So this is the part, as you can read there, concern features of tasks. A task model framework for describing and constructing situations in which examinees act. We think about it, test time, what kind of test format, multiple choice, simulation, essay, whatever. Those are all in the task models. You see here, specification for the stimulus material, conditions, and affordance, and this is the task model. And you get products. Okay, so those are the three basic model of the third layer of ECD, the conceptual assessment framework. And now comes the fourth layer. This is called assessment implementation. As you can read there, this layer is closely related to item writing and test form assembly. Think about how, in traditional test development, our item writing on test form assembly, right? We can have linear test, student take a item, or adaptive, or multi-stage. Those are all involved here. And task shells are often used here. Here we have one example also from Ms. Levy's slides. What is the, in the bracket we have the variables we can manipulate in writing items of the following distribution. 20 to 30, 2-digit numbers in random number. Okay, then you specify they are allowed to use calculators. So there, if you want to come up with different items, you see you can choose mean or media or mode, right? You can choose either one of them, then come up with different items. Okay, they call this a task shell. This is getting really popular nowadays because they do lots of automatic item generation, which save you lots of money and time for pre-calibration. Because if they are generated from the same task shell, usually they have similar psychometric properties. So this is a really, really hot area right now.
Rule-based item generation?
Rule-based or whatever you call it. You basically you have a common part and then some moving parts you can manipulate. Yeah, they go by different names. Automatic item generation, whatever. That's what is going on nowadays. Okay. Then the last part is assessment delivery. This is the last layer. This layer, include 4 processes. Activity selection. Think about we have a GAT test form. Which items we are going to choose, right? This is activity selection. Presentation, whether here we have paper-based or computer-based. This is a presentation, the presentation format there. And response processing, how do we collect their responses? And how to score them. And summary scoring, what we're going to give them. Like here we give them a scale score based on the center. Or we can give them a classification, right? Proficient, in the middle, or below proficient. Those are all like, it's in this layer. So those are the 5 layers of ECD, okay? And this is, like I said, is a very gentle snapshot. This is the whole idea of this thing. So the third part, let me talk briefly about the used in testing industry. We want to know, our rivals and competitors, how they're doing. So ECD is an extremely complex and time-consuming process that requires a tremendous amount of resources and manpower. So this is the thing we should keep in mind. Probably because this ECD, to the best of knowledge, has not been widely used in the testing industry. Miss Levy is at ETS. When he developed this, he was there. So ETS is using this systematically. I don't know any other doing this. College Board, I think they want to use this for their AP Advanced Placement exam in 2000. They were pretty ambitious at that time. They had a whole issue of applied measurement in education, talking about their applying ECD in their tests. And then this time I went to the conference in States, July. I met one of the senior directors. She told me they stopped everything. It's too much. It's too much for them. College Board is an organization with lots of resources. So they stopped that. So this is like she told me it's very, not just time consuming and also very political, and people are arguing all the time. Think about the reasoning process, right? Everybody is playing devil's advocate. What do you mean by this? What kind of evidence do you have? Like, whatever you say, you need evidence to back it up. If you keep doing this for days, I'm gonna go nuts. Okay, that's my, my reaction. Okay, okay, but let's talk about the last, this part, applying ECD principles in practice. Well, although it's very resources demanding, it doesn't hurt for test developers to apply in practice some ECD principles. I think it's a rigorous reasoning framework, and that are logistically feasible. This is important considering the kind of resources we have. Here I want to give you an example. This is the famous, probably the most famous static item, analogy item. This is I used this last year at my div presentation last year. But anyway, this is an analogy. You have runner and a marathon. You want to choose the right analogy choice among the 5 choices. This is a biased stat item. But can you gentlemen take a look and tell me what the answer is? It might be difficult, right? So runner and marathon, analogy item. The correct answer is C, horseman or regatta. You might not know regatta, but let me talk about what is regatta. Regatta is a series of rowboat races. Here we go, okay? And you see, we have Harvard, Yale, this, big rival thing going on. Okay, so why is this a biased item? Why is this a biased item? Because regatta is a sport that's only people like in the New England area, like from usually the more wealthier family, they know this. People in New Mexico or West Coast, they never heard of this. So this is a biased item. And we can imagine we ask a student here to take this item. How is he gonna know regatta, right? He may have very high reasoning ability, but he cannot finish this item. Okay, it's biased. Okay, so, so assuming we have item this, can we use the ECD, some of ECD to help item writers not to write items like this? I think let's give it a shot. Okay, using the evidentiary reasoning process. Okay, so here our data is we observe a student have an incorrect response to the regatta item. He didn't choose C. Okay, what kind of claim are we trying to make? The examinee has low verbal reasoning skill, right? This is a claim we try to make because he did it wrong. Okay, and what is our warrant? Since an examinee with high verbal reasoning skill should be able to answer this item correctly, right? This is our warrant. How do we back up? Because we trust our test developers' expertise. They have been doing this for such a long time. They know this. Okay, but are there any exceptions? Unless he needs additional KSAs to answer this item correctly. So basically, we are saying this item is not just measuring verbal reasoning ability, it's measuring something else. Okay? And support, do we have supports? Yes, we have. Familiarity with the regatta plays a role in this item. You have to know that word. So it is a support that students from wealthy family in New England area are more likely to know. So in this case, hopefully, you can, preclude the possibility of coming up with diff items. Because think about it, we do all kinds of diff analysis. It's post hoc measure. It's time consuming and waste lots of resources. Imagine you have a diff item there, a biased item there. You are going to exclude it from your scoring process or whatever. And imagine you have multiple parallel forms. If you exclude one here and now one there, you have lots of decisions you have to make. With this, hopefully it can save you lots of energy, resources, and time, to apply this evidentiary reasoning process. Okay, that's my opinion upon this. I don't think using this systematically and holistically is feasible right now for the center, but there are parts our test developers should be aware of. Okay, so this is one example. I hope give you some idea. Okay, so all those are just talk from like a psychometrician who doesn't get involved in test development. It's good. I think it might add need to the presentation. We have a test developer in the center, to talk about his experience with ECD. With that, we'll have Buren and share with us his experience with using ECD. Thank you.
Okay, so we had a general or a very gentle introduction, and we have a partial implementation here. So I'll give a couple of examples of how ECD is used a little bit in language testing. And I'll give a couple of examples of some exploratory work we have been doing in the department as well. So we might argue that language testing is the area where ECD is used the most and has been implemented to the largest degree in many cases. We have, for example, Miss Levy, who is the grandmaster of ECD. He regularly uses language testing as an example when he does his, tries to make the framework more concrete. And this, of course, has spilled on and influenced language testers to use this when they are working on their tests. Also, Michael Kane regularly publishes on language testing when he talks about validation, which is closely related to what Miss Levy is doing. We have the two main, probably the two most famous researchers and influential researchers in language testing are Bachman and Palmer. And they have been working on this for a long, long time, using evidence-centered design in their test development procedures. They have come up with something called an AUA, or an assessment use argument, which is based on Toulmin's argument structure, which they use and have explained. And I have made an experiment where I have written an AUA for our EPT test using this argument approach. TOEFL have used evidence-centered design from the very start when they started developing the TOEFL IBT in the early 2000s. And we also have the social cognitive framework, which is developed at Lancaster University by Ware and others, and is used in the Cambridge exams. So all of these are basically indications of that language testing have actually gone quite far in their implementation of ECD. And it's definitely the case that any language conference you go to, this is going to come up and people are going to show what they are doing with regards to these things. Also, the CFR is based on ECD approaches in the way it was designed and in the way it was developed. And it also encourages users to find support for how they interpret and how they use the CFR themselves. So there are quotes in the CFR like, we're raising questions, not answering them. And this is a phrase which comes back hundreds of times in the framework. They explain a thing, a background to a language skill. They will then present a scale for that language skill from A1 very low to C2 very high. And then they will always say, users may wish to consider and where appropriately state, why are you using this? What are you going to do? What is your reasoning, etc. So if you use this in the, if you're going to use ECD in language development, like for example in language testing, you will have these three parts in the conceptual assessment framework which Young just referred to, the student model and the evidence models and the task model. Now if this is going to work, if they're going to be like this, which is what we want them to be like pieces of a puzzle that interlock. I can now push these three together and they will form one nice unity, right? If I'm going to do this, this doesn't have a laser, but I have to make sure that the pockets on one side of the, on one piece is the same as the tab on the next piece, so that they fit together. So I have to have an evidentiary reasoning process from the student model to the task model to the evidence model, back and forward. And to do this, I first have to know what is my student model so I can make my task model. This means that I need to have my domain model, first of all. What are the things that are happening here? For example, in language, what are people doing with the language? How are they using it, etc. And then I can feed that into my student model, and I can start feeding it, creating my tasks, see how, what measurement and models, etc. should I use to make this fit and so on. This is the ideal situation. But what most often happens in language testing, or in other testing as well, is that I don't really know what my domain model is. I haven't done a proper analysis of the domain, so I don't really know what are the things that I should be testing. This means that I don't really know what my student model is anymore. I have kind of a vague idea, and I can make assumptions about my student model, but I don't have the evidence. So what's going to happen then? Well, I cannot do my task model on the far right because it's also going to be vague. What is it? And how am I then going to make sure it's going to interlock with my evidence model? So what happens more often than not in testing in general, and this is why this framework was developed and why it has gained so much popularity, is that people refer to numbers instead of referring to content. So psychometric evidence in this sense it doesn't really become relevant until you link it to the student model, you link it to the task model, and then you can go ahead. And this is why Ms. Levy says the following. If you want to have the full meaning of any model, if you want to have full meaning in your psychometric data as an example, you have to have that to be clearly be able to show the interrelationship with the other parts in the structure, with the student model, with the task model, which is based on the domain model, etc. And you have to design these in parallel. You have to know when at the start of designing an assessment that the various models, student model, evidence model, task model, that they fit and that they're informed by the domain model. If you don't coordinate this from the start, you cannot make a complete and coherent argument. And we will see an example of what happens when you forget some things in the beginning soon. So Bachman and Parman say that without comparability of constructs and task characteristics, those are the student model and the task model, any demonstration of statistical equivalence will be meaningless. And he also, I'm only quoting him now, he also told me this in 2014 in June. He said, do not let the psychometric tail wag the testing dog. Right. That was in informal conversation. It was not, he never wrote this. Be a bit more careful. Yes. Right. So we talked about domain analysis. I want to know what domain of language use, because we use that as our example here, is it that I'm after? What's happening out there? What are people doing in the language? What are the valued skills or valued knowledge that we talked about? So I want to know what kind of vocab and grammar and functions like asking for permission or making a request or giving an order or whatever it might be. What kind of scenarios do people use the language in? That my test takers, What are they going to do? Let's say they go to university here. What are they actually going to do with their English? What is the scenario when that they do with reading and writing and listening and speaking and so on? I can create proficiency paradigms like if you're proficient in this, you should be able to do that, and so on. So I want to analyze my domain and model my domain. So I use multiple sources to do this, right? So I can have a native speaker model that I can use. I can use a language learner model like the CFR and the supporting work there. I can use learner input, let them describe what they are doing. I can use teacher judgment, let them talk about what they would like their students to do, what they value. I can look in textbooks for academic English as an example. I can look at tests. I can look at academic syllabi. And I can do a workplace and academia analysis. Now, these are all parts that form the domain model. I'm just going to give an example of what TOEFL did with the workplace and academia analysis to understand how ETS used ECD and the amount of work that they put in, that they interpreted ECD as meaning for them. Now, we are here at the center. We have now completed a 20-page questionnaire for our users of STEP that we are going to send out and have sent back, and then it will talk about what do you value in listening and speaking, and et cetera, et cetera. And we think this is a good way to start analyzing the domain and describing it. And we hope to send this to maybe 30 or 40 institutions or something. Now, this may sound like pretty substantial work, but in an ECD's perspective, it's very much only scratching the surface. When TOEFL started to develop the TOEFL IBT, they went out and said, okay, what is the domain that we are after? We are after first year English usage at North American universities. So they went out and they recorded, transcribed thousands of academic lectures in the first year, all across the country, in all types of majors. They recorded classroom conversations, conversations between teachers and students. They took thousands and thousands of undergraduate academic texts, and they turned all of this into one big language corpus. And then they tagged the corpus to say exactly what was happening in all these different exchanges, etc., that was going on. And then they analyzed it, and they came up with what are the salient features of academic English first-year North American universities. What kind of situations happen? In those situations, what vocabulary is used? What grammar is used? In writing, what kind of transitional devices are used when you write in academia, etc., 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 etc. This took them years to do. And they made a mistake, which is coming back to haunt them. This was in the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, the CFR was not even published. It was published in 2001. So when they started this, the CFR was just coming out into publication. And no one expected that it would be as influential as it has become. It's influential for English in every part of the world, for many other languages as well in many parts of the world. Now, the old framework used in the States, the ACTFL, is basically out of business. The CFR has taken over totally. It's been spread by Americans into America at a very, very large scale. So TOEFL get the question all the time. If you go to the TOEFL website, frequently asked questions, the first one is, what are the CFR levels for the TOEFL scores? They didn't put that into their domain analysis. They didn't use the learner language models from the CFR when they did that, so they didn't put it into their student model, so it's not in the task model, so it's not in the evidence model. So they can do now a humble attempt at post hoc relation between the CFR and TOEFL. Whereas Pearson can come and say, listen, why would you listen to TOEFL's CFR scores? We have this from the beginning. The descriptors are completely integrated from the beginning. Cambridge can say the same thing. IELTS can make a very strong argument for this as well. And this is causing a lot of trouble for them. And they have to admit that this is post hoc and it's not really working. Yes?
But when we talk with them, for the people who are practicing the software,
Yeah.
using the CFR
Yeah. They do mention them. Yeah.
You will find it in the brochures and everything.
True, true. It's there, but it's not evidence-based. This is the point. They will mention these are rough ranges for the CFR, approximate like this, approximate like that, but they never make an evidence argument about it. They mention even as caveats in their publications about the CFR relation that this is a post hoc and is not like full linkage to the CFR. You should be careful with the interpretation. They mention this themselves. So they show it on the surface, but there's no evidence under. If I come in with the Toulmin argument structure for their CFR linkage, they will be in big problems. This is the point. Now, let's look at the test development process here quickly. So we understand that when we have done our domain model, we have done only a small part of the whole thing, right? Because if we have our test development circle here, or our test development process here, we have the domain analysis and description, and specification, item writing, etc. These all revolve around the test purpose, right? So all of these revolve around the test purpose, so you can see. And then we sort of start up there with the domain analysis, and this gives our specification, which is sort of the student model kind of thing, and task models. And then we start with item writing and review, we trial, analyze, we give light test form, we post-analyze, we come back, and we have to start again to see what happened during this. That may inform our domain model, which may inform our student model, which may inform our task model, etc. So this is like an ongoing thing. And all of this, of course, has to be cross-fed by research. All of these stages have to be informed and cross-fed and updated by research all the time. All right, then it's a continuous process that goes on and on and on and on. So let's take a snapshot of this and see what we could do to approach ECD in our own work here at the center. If we look at the specification and item writing, so this is like the task model kind of thing that we're getting into here, right? We have a student model, we have a task model, now we're going to write to these task models. Let's take a look at what it might mean to start analyzing this and working with it. We create task model specifications, as Ms. Levy calls them. I'm going to give you a handout of one of those, which is a rough draft of one of those for the step test. So what we want to do is, when we create these task specification, model specifications, we want to have a thought-through argument for providing students with the opportunity to demonstrate targeted proficiencies in ways we will know how to interpret. This is the goal of designing the task model. And Ms. Levy and colleagues also go on to say that there are hundreds of aspects of any assessment that could be standardized or not, to varying degrees and in myriad configurations. So I'm going to give you here, this is a proposed outline draft to what a task model, which is trying to move towards ECD, might look like. This is for an academic lecture and answering items after listening to an academic lecture. So I'm going to hand this out, and I'll give you a couple of minutes to flick through, and then we'll zoom in on a couple of aspects here. Now, this, as you can see, when you create a task model like this, it entails making a large set of decisions. In this case, we have 67 different variables that make up the whole thing, right? It's all about the general description and then what language abilities we're testing. We then get a more detailed description of the task. Then we get a detailed description of the input text. And then we get information about the speakers and the quality of the recording, the expected responses, the scoring, and then we have a sample task at the end, which is actually written to this specification. I asked one of our item writers to write a sample task based on this, which is at the very end. So there's quite a few things to look at when you want to do something like this. Now, all of these 67 aspects that we have here, they should in ECD be based on evidence-based reasoning. I should be able to draw a Toulmin structure and defend each thing I have in this specification. I should be able to argue for everything. And I will give you a couple of examples of this just very briefly. If we go to page 4, I think it is. Yes, page 4. We can see there's an area which is highlighted there. Okay. So this is about language features in the input text. And here we can see that one of the things which is being mentioned here, one of the many decisions we have to make about an academic lecture, a simplified academic lecture, is what kind of organizational patterns and devices for the rhetorical part of it do we need to have. So there is a mentioning here that we should include language typical to academic lectures. One such thing is rhetorical organizational patterns, definition, contrast, comparison, etc., etc., etc. Right? So when I think about these, I have to think about why am I including these devices and not others? Is one of them more important than the other? I should be able to argue and I should be able to explain myself every time. I also have to think about, because I'm targeting this at ECFR B1 level, so are some of these concepts and perhaps the actual vocabulary, the devices, are they too complex for the B1 level? So it says here, in brackets, see attached list of graded rhetorical devices, because you're writing for B1, so you cannot throw any device in there. There are some of them which are B2, which are C1, which you shouldn't use. So I'm going to give my writer then the following document as well, which is this. Let's see if it opens. Is it open? Yes. This is a list of rhetorical devices that can be used in STEP academic for B1 and STEP academic domain for B1 and B2 texts and lectures. They can be written or they can be spoken. So I have a few for each here. So if someone is looking to use an additive rhetorical device, there's a list here of different additive rhetorical devices, and they are graded to their CFR levels. So they can refer to this to make sure that they are using the right kind of vocabulary. It should be B1 or below because it's a B1 task. If they want to use resultative, they have a few to choose from. If they want to use contrastive, they have a few to choose from. And then time, maybe, concessive, inference, summative, listing, metatextual, etc. All of these are already there listed, and this is evidence that when I use one of these, I know that I'm targeting the right level. Okay? I can argue for every rhetorical device I put in there that it should be there, and and why certain others should not be in there. And I have gotten the CFR levels from major research projects which have graded vocabulary to the CFR. So I've used double sourced this from two different projects like this, and with two different research methods and two different views of language models. So I have a pretty solid evidence when I give someone this list. So this is how I can reason about that. And that, of course, is only part of the whole story, because this is only one of 67 parts of my task model. Let's look at another one. Just below that is text readability. It means how accessible the text is to students at different levels. So I have a couple of things I look at. I will look at the classical Flesch-Kincaid, which is like sentence length and word length, and then you get a grade level. So I say it has to be smaller than 7, meaning from grade 7 upwards for native speakers. Then we have something called the Col Metrics. I haven't set any ranges here, but Col Metrics is this device or this online tool which is based on massive natural language processing research, which gives you indices of how complex a text is in English, right? And it gives you five surface indices, but it's based on 500 sub-indices that the engine can analyze and give you a result. So I run my text, the same text which is at the end of the example here. I run that through the Col Metrics machine, and then I feed this into, this is a snapshot of our text description form that we use for our language for listening and reading texts. So it gives these indices: narrativity, syntactic simplicity, word concreteness, referential cohesion, deep cohesion, and so on. Now, it's all nice to look at, right? And I can see, I get a description of the text here as well, how easy it is to read. And if I look at these, I may think, okay, this looks pretty good. But what I actually have to do is, and I was asked this question, it's honest, I was asked this question directly when I was at eAlta this year. I was at a workshop and we were talking a little bit about text description and text selection. And there was a Greek lady who asked me, what are your Col Metrics indices for text selection for B1? And I said, well, I'm working on that. So it's like you have to understand that you go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into these things. Anyway, we can skip this part. And what about if we have all of this? We have a detailed description like this one. We have thought about our rhetorical devices, and let's think we have thought about everything which is in this one. There's also something else we could have done, which they do in Pearls, which is the junior version of PISA, basically, for reading. What they do is they take every text that they use and they create a model like this. They create a diagram with the ideas and the information in every text that they are going to use, and then they use this to see where is the main idea, where are the supporting details, what parts are perhaps inferential, and so on. So this is for a descriptive model of text. Then they have one for thematic model. It's a different one, because now they want to talk about the theme, the main idea, the supporting ideas. This is what they want to test. So they have to find a text that can do that, and they have to map it to show that it can do that. Then they have one for cause effect. This is a different one. Now I want to test cause effect. The students understand that. So I have to find a text and map it so that I understand exactly what the cause effect is, and then I can see where can I put my item here. Or sequential episode. Students should understand in what sequence things are happening. I have to have a different kind of model. If I want to compare and contrast, I have yet another model. Right? And so on and so on and so forth. And you go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And everything should be supported by evidential reasoning all the time. This is the idea. So how feasible is this for QIAS? Well, if we look at the TOEFL, when they developed the TOEFL IBT, they had 18 researchers who worked only on the content. This does not include psychometricians, support personnel, or anything like that. 18 people working on this, it took them 7 years. Now, test fees for TOEFL and IELTS, as an example, are around 1,000 reals each. There's a reason for that, of course. They're doing some of this, or not a lot of this. It takes a lot of manpower, it takes a lot of resources to do this. So the test fees goes up. So one strategic thing to think about, I believe, is how much can we raise our prices on our products by doing this? Because it will raise costs for test production to work in this way, even if you don't only do it partially. How much can we raise our costs before people choose another test? If we add speaking and writing, for example, to the step test, that's likely to raise the test by 100 or 200 reals. Can we then also put in more resources into reading, into listening, and that will go up even more? What's the limit? And that's not only for STEP, it goes for every test, of course. I think that everyone who is managing a test day should think about what parts of ECD, not the whole ECD, but what parts of ECD that would add the most value to their tests, and then start by applying their resources accordingly, slowly, slowly, slowly. Because taking it on as a whole, I think is just not in scope at all. But it would be possible to identify key parts that would add as much value as possible. And this alone, of course, is a major undertaking for any department to do. We'll skip a couple of those. So if we look at the QIAS vision, to be an international reference in the field of measurement and evaluation. The field of the organizations that are being referred to now, they all do this. If we want to approach this vision, which is a grand vision, it's a vision that should be there, somehow ECD has to be part of that. Otherwise, it's not going to work. I think that's as simple as it is. I have some reading tips if you're interested. This is all directly or indirectly to ECD. We have the Standards for Educational Psychological Testing, of course. Backman and Palmer, they have Languages Has Been in Practice, brilliant book. This is a masterpiece, I think, the Building with the Validity Argument for the TOEFL. It's a very concrete, hands-on explanation. And Miss Levy has this basic paper from 2003 on the structure of assessment. Like Young said, if you want to fall asleep, that's perfect. And you can also go back to the, if you want to understand the philosophical, basis of the argument structure, you can go directly to Toulmin, which is in 58, I think, or 50. You had him as 52. I think it's 58. And it was republished in 2003. And I will have them in my office, and fees are very reasonable. Okay, some words of wisdom at the end. We have our two friends here who discuss testing in different ways, and so on. So we have the rabbit here. He's always in a hurry. He's always worried. He just wants to move forward, just wants to get things done. He's always like that. He works as a postman. He just wants to get things out, So he says, why don't you do ECD? It's easy, just do it. And then we have the turtle here, who is a scientist and a philosopher and so on. So he says, well, if you're so keen on it, you go do it, Because that's just like telling someone do ECD. It's like, it's easy to say when you don't have to do the work, That's the way it is. So I think that some of the scientific committees to some of our tests here say, why don't you do some ECD? That could be a good answer. Yes. Thank you.